So this week's Parsha is Parshas Tzav. It begins on page 569 in the Art Scroll Chumash. So, and begins, Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, on page 569 in the Art Scroll Chumash, this chapter 6, verse 1, Parshas Tzav. Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, command Aaron and his son saying, this is the law of the elevation offering. It is the elevation offering that stays on the flame on the altar all night until morning, and the fire of the altar shall be kept aflame on it. The Kohen shall don his fitted linen tunic, and he shall don linen breeches on his flesh. He shall separate the ash of what the fire consumed of the elevation offering on the altar and place it next to the altar. He shall remove his garments and don other garments, and he shall remove the ash to the outside of the camp to a pure place. And it continues in verse 5, the fire of the altar shall be kept burning on it, shall not be extinguished. And the Kohen shall kindle wood upon it every morning. He shall prepare the elevation offering upon it, and shall cause the fats of the peace offering to go up and smoke upon it. A permanent fire shall remain aflame on the altar. It shall not be extinguished. So the first point I'd like to make is that it says in verse 2, command Aaron and his son saying, which would seem to make sense because we're giving the laws of the offerings. Yet in Vayikra, last week's Parsha, it did not say that really. It didn't say command Aaron saying. It said Hashem said to Moshe and told him to speak to the children of Israel and gave all the laws of the offering. So why over here is it specifically to Aaron and his sons? So the Ramban says that in last week's Parsha, it was giving the general rules of the offerings, the different classifications of offering, what animals they bring. And that's something that's relevant to really all the children of Israel. Everybody has to know what kinds of offerings they'd bring, what they'd bring them for, and what kind of animals they'd bring, and the basic procedures of how they're brought. This week's Parsha goes into more detail on each offering, how it's brought, and that's more relevant to the Kohanim because they're the ones who are actually bringing the offering. So here specifically to Aaron.
What is the Parsha? So,
well, it doesn't really. It's going to go more in detail in this week's Parsha. So it's really not that vague. So, but it begins with the elevation offering. And okay, I'll go straight into this. And what's the first mitzvah? It says, this is the law of the elevation offering. It is the elevation offering. So it repeats that. Instead of this is the law of the elevation offering continued, it says, this is the law of the elevation offering. It is the elevation offering that stays on the flame on the altar all night until morning, and the fire of the altar should be kept aflame on it. So the Orach Chaim says on this, he comments on that first part, that this is the elevation offering. It is the elevation offering that he says that in kind of a midrashic sense, that it's when it says this is the Torah of the elevation offering. So it's saying which elevation offering are we talking about? So it says it is the Ola is the Hebrew word, and the Orach Chaim says that that's a reference to a verse in the Shir Hashem and the Songs of Songs that it says, who is this who is Ola min midvar, who is going up from the desert? And that's a reference to the Jewish people who Hashem took us out of Egypt through the desert and brought us up into the land of Israel. So we were what's referred to as the ones who are Ola, the ones who went up from the desert. So he says, what's the Ola? What's the offering that we're referring to? Is referring to the Jewish people. And it continues, that stays on the flame on the altar all night until morning, and the fire of the altar shall be kept aflame on it. So the Klei Yakar explains this based on that Orach Chaim, that the night that it's talking about here, that it stays on the flame on the altar all night until morning, the night is referring to the darkness of the exile. When we're in exile, until the morning, until the coming of the dawn, until the light, until we're redeemed, that we're going to go through suffering. We're going to have a difficult time of it. And that's the fire that's burning us all night, all through this exile. But that fire that's burning us, it's the fire of the altar. And that's a heavenly fire. And we find that, for example, by the burning bush, when Moshe saw the bush that was burning, but it wasn't being consumed. And the Ramban says it wasn't being consumed because it was a heavenly fire. And the heavenly fire burns, but it doesn't consume, it doesn't destroy. And also by the altar, that there was a fire burning in the altar in the tabernacle constantly, yet the altar wasn't burnt up, even though it was made out of wood with just a thin layer of copper covering the wood, but it never got burnt. And that's because it was a heavenly fire that was burning on the altar, and that does not destroy. And that's what it's telling us, is that we'll be troubled by the fire, we'll be in great distress in our exile, but we will not be destroyed by the fire of the exile. And it'll burn on from even all through the night until morning, until we're ultimately redeemed at the time of Mashiach. Okay, another comment they say on this, that it says this is the law of the elevation offering. It is the elevation offering that our sages say, and we spoke about this last week, that one who studies the laws of the offerings, it's considered as if they actually brought the offering. And in this case, it's telling us that nowadays we don't have a temple, we don't have a tabernacle, we can't bring an offering, but we could study the laws of the offerings, and through that, the Torah of the offering, the law, the study of the offerings, that is the offering. It's as if we actually brought it. Okay, so then, where am I? So in verse 3, once again, that the Kohen wears his special garments of the Kohen, and he takes some of the ashes off the altar. This was the first of the services of the temple that was done every day. And he would take some of the ashes and bring it down and put it next to the altar, and eventually they'd clear it out to a place outside of the tabernacle.
So in other words, he has to change clothes every time he does something.
Yes. So this is it's a holy work that what the work is he's taking some of the ashes from the altar and bringing it down. But when he's disposing of it, because that's considered, it's in a sense garbage disposal. It's holy work, but it is garbage disposal. So he wouldn't wear the same clothing that he'd wear when he's bringing the offerings. I say just say they compare it to they say that when someone's cooking for the king.
Oh yeah.
So he doesn't serve the king in the same clothing that he's wearing when he's doing the cooking. When he's cooking, he's in front of the fire. He's getting all sweaty and and all dirty from the fire. So he doesn't. So he's going to cook in those clothing, and he's going to wear special clothes when he's cooking for the king. But before he serves the king, he's going to change his clothes into clean clothes.
Like a kitchen.
Exactly.
I know that. I've had these cooks and chefs come in at night when I used to on night duty, and they smell like cooking oil.
But cooking oil and sweat, and it's hot in there. They're in front of ovens and stoves, right? So even though they're wearing the uniform, but they're going to change before they serve the king. And that's what it's telling us here, is that the Kohen did not wear the same clothing while he was disposing of the ashes that he wore when he was doing the services in the temple. But at the same time, our sages say that this was that it used to be, the Mishnah in Yuma says that it used to be that they would actually, most offerings, like how they would give out the offerings, they would do by a lottery. That they would, which Kohen would do which service, they would have a lottery where they would all put out a finger, and someone would pick a number, and a high number, and they would count around until they'd get to the first person, and they'd say, okay, you're doing the first service, and then the next person, the next person, the next person, the next person are doing the other services. 1 second. But with the ashes, with the clearing off of the ashes, it used to be that they would actually have a race. And the Kohanim would run up the ramp, and the first one to get to the top would be the one to do it. And the reason for this is because it was the first thing that was done very early in the morning, so they wanted to make sure that the Kohanim would get there early. But there was one time that it was very close. They were nose to nose, and what happened, Alan?
One of them stabbed the other.
Well, this is a different case. The Mishnah says this is a different case. The Mishnah says that one of them pushed the other one, and he fell off the ramp, and he broke his leg. Right. It's the case of the Mishnah.
One that said one of them stabbed.
Right. That was a different Gemara. Right.
And the father of the victim said, "I have to get the knife out of it, otherwise it'll become
impure." Exactly right. But this is the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that one of them pushed the other one. He fell off the ramp, and he broke his leg. So then instead of the race, even for this first service of clearing off the ashes, they did it by lottery as well.
But the ashes would move up at the top and then put down next to
yes,
the altar.
And that was
when it finally built up high enough, then they would take it from there and take it outside.
Yes, that's correct. Yes, so they would put the daily service of the removal of the ashes, they would put it next to the altar, as Fred said. And as Fred said, that later on, once they got like a nice buildup, they had a lot of ashes up there, then they would bring it outside the camp. Okay, so moving on in verse 5, it says, the fire of the altar shall be kept burning on it, it shall not be extinguished. So there was a constant fire that was constantly burning on the altar. It says, and the Kohen shall kindle wood upon it every morning. He shall prepare the elevation offering upon it. He shall cause the fats of the peace offerings to go up and smoke upon it. A permanent fire shall remain a flame on the altar. It shall not be extinguished. And the Mishnah in Yuma says that in fact there were three fires there were three like wood piles on the altar that had fires burning it. One of them was this constant fire. There's one that was kept constantly burning. They never allowed it to go out. There was one that they brought the tamid, they burnt the parts of the offering on. And there was another one that they took coals that they used to burn the incense in the inner altar. So when they burnt the incense, they took coals from a wood pile that was kept burning on the outer altar, and they brought it into the inner altar and then put the incense on top of it, and that's what caused the incense to burn. And then it goes into the meal offerings, and in verse 7 on page 571, this is the law of the meal offerings. The son of Aaron shall bring it before Hashem to the front of the altar. He shall separate from it with his 3 fingers full, some of the fine flour of the meal offering and some of its oil and the frankincense that is the meal offering. Shall cause them to go up and smoke on the altar for a satisfying aroma. It's a memorial portion unto Hashem. So he would take a small portion. There was really a lot of flour and oil that was used in the meal offering, but he would just take a handful, like we said, 3 fingers full, that he would take a handful and use 3 fingers to enclose it, and use his other finger, his pinky and his thumb, to clean out the sides. So it's just 3 fingers. That small amount would be burnt on the altar, and the rest of the offering would be eaten by the Kohanim. And in verse 12, Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, "This is the offering of Aaron and his sons, which each shall offer to Hashem on the day he is inaugurated." That there was a special offering that each Kohen would bring on the first day of their service in the temple. 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour is a continual meal offering, half of it in the morning, half of it in the afternoon. It shall be made on a pan with oil scalded. Shall you bring it a repeatedly baked meal offering, broken into pieces? You shall offer it as a satisfying aroma to Hashem. But this one is different because in verse, or I'll just continue, verse 15, the Kohen from among his sons who is anointed in his place shall perform it. It is an eternal decree for Hashem. It shall be caused to go up and smoke in its entirety. Every meal offering of a Kohen is to be entirely caused to go up and smoke. It shall not be eaten. So this offering of the inauguration of when a Kohen does on his first day of service, so that one is not eaten by the Kohanim, it's burnt up entirely. And as it says in verse 15, it says, the Kohen from among his sons who is anointed in his place. Who's the Kohen who's anointed? That's the Kohen Gadol. So he also brings this offering, but instead of like a regular Kohen who brought it only on the first day of service, he would bring it every single day. And so the Kohen Gadol would bring a meal offering every single day in the temple, the same one that every Kohen would bring on his inauguration. Then in verse 17, on page 573, Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his son, saying, this is the law of the sin offering. In the place where the elevation is offering is slaughtered, shall the sin offering be slaughtered before Hashem. It is most holy." And like we said, why is it slaughtered in the same place as the elevation offering? Because people might be embarrassed that they're bringing a sin offering. That's an admission that they're doing a sin, which isn't the end of the world to admit that someone did a sin, but it doesn't have to be publicly. And this is in front of everybody. Everybody in the temple would be able to see that they're bringing a sin offering. So therefore, it's slaughtered in the same place that the elevation offering is brought, so people wouldn't know which one they're bringing. And it continues in verse 19, the Kohen who performs its sin offering service shall eat it. It shall be eaten in a holy place in the courtyard of the tent of meeting, that they're not allowed to bring it out of the tent of meeting. It has to be eaten inside. And in verse 20, whoever touches its flesh becomes holy.
They have to consume it all at a certain time.
Yes, and we'll get into that later with some other offerings, what exactly the time they have to consume it is. So this is actually a very interesting verse that we're studying right now in the Kollel. We're learning the laws of kosher, but of kosher mixtures, like where something not kosher falls into a kosher mixture. Like let's say you have some so you have like a little bit of milk falls into meat, or you have some non-kosher meat fell into your challah.
Oh.
Yeah. So what exactly the issues are there? So this verse right here, where it says, whatever touches its flesh becomes holy. So that becomes very important there. That what does that mean? Whatever touches its flesh becomes holy. That means that if you have, let's say, regular meat touches the chatas, touches the meat of the offering, that meat becomes holy as well. And this, by the same measure, at least according to some opinions, it depends. There's a few different ways to understand this verse, but let's say, according to some, the same way that if a regular piece of meat touches the offering meat, it becomes holy. So if a kosher piece of meat touches a non-kosher piece of meat, it would become prohibited for the same measure. But the way we go with this is that you need 1/60. So basically, whether it's a Torah law or rabbinic, depending on the circumstances, if you have 60 times the kosher to the non-kosher, so let's say you have 60 ounces of kosher and 1 ounce of non-kosher, so that is okay, and you're allowed to eat that. But if if you know where it is,
Can't really tell.
well, if you could tell, let's say you have, and you could find the milk, right. That's true. So,
but if it's
right. So if you know where it is, let's say, I'll just go just very briefly. If you do know where it is, let's say you have a cholent and you have a piece of non-kosher meat falls in. You know where that you could tell what, you could recognize that piece of meat. So you take it out, but it would still be not kosher, presuming that it was hot when it fell in, unless you have 60 times against the non-kosher meat, but you still have to take it out.
You can take
Yeah,
a non-kosher rib steak,
Yeah.
boneless ribeye,
yes,
take a kosher boneless ribeye, both
Right.
Angus pieces of meat,
right.
and you cannot visually tell the difference.
Right. No. I'm saying that you like it, you
Good
see the
chunk
shape.
of meat, if-
Yeah. It
if
looks
you have a
exactly the
chuck
same.
roast
Yeah,
And a chunk of kosher chuck is in the pot,
right,
have a non-kosher chuck,
right.
have a piece the same size as the one that's in
Right.
there. It falls in. There's no way in the world that
Right.
you can tell the
And
difference.
that's also, and you're right. If you can't
No,
tell
no,
the
no,
difference,
no,
that's
no,
also
no.
a factor. And if you can't tell the difference,
No,
Right.
but
but I'm
But
saying
that's very
sometimes just based on the size or whatever, you could tell based on the size or whatever it is. The non-kosher piece of meat was smaller than any other piece of meat in the cholent, whatever it is. If you know which piece it is, you have to take it out. If you do not know which piece, as I said, assuming that you have 60 times kosher as not kosher in the mixture, that you could eat that cholent.
help me understand how that could happen.
Yeah.
If you have a kosher kitchen, possible. How can it be possible that non-kosher meat is not even in there?
You would hope it would. It shouldn't be, but you're right. It shouldn't be. Let's say a babysitter came in, and let's say a non-Jewish nanny came in and brought their lunch, and who knows? But in any case, you're right. In most cases, in a kosher kitchen, this shouldn't be an issue. Any kitchen that has any hashgacha that has, they won't.
That nanny.
I remember seeing a
Yeah.
nanny on TV.
Yeah.
I get it now.
Yeah. Or let's say, and like Fred said, the more common issue is when some milk. Let's say you're pouring milk for the kid, and as you're pouring, sometimes it happens to the best of us that we're holding a cup of milk and the cup flies out of your hand, and a few drops of milk falls inside the cholent or inside the chicken soup. So that would be like milk and meat in a kosher kitchen is a more common issue. Okay.
That's provided it's cow's milk or goat milk, because almond milk is.
It's okay.
Yes, that's
It's
correct.
okay.
Right.
It's
It
fine.
has to be animal milk. And okay, I'll leave it at that. It has to be animal milk. It happens to be that non-kosher milk does not make something prohibited as milk and meat, but of course it's prohibited as being non-kosher. So like if you have, let's say, pig's milk or camel milk, so that does not actually prohibit a mixture as milk and meat.
Pig milk.
Yeah, you can't eat it because it's pig milk. You're not allowed to eat a milk from a non-kosher animal, but there are halachic ramifications for this. One of them is that you're not allowed to cook milk and meat together, and you're not allowed to derive benefits. So you're not allowed to cook milk and meat together. But if it's pig's milk, you can. There's no halachic issue with that. You are allowed to cook pig's milk with. You can't eat it, but let's say you're making it for your non-Jewish friend, so that would be okay. We wouldn't be allowed to. Let's say you have
Okay, you can't.
right. So let's say you could derive benefit from it too. As long as it's
Okay.
not kosher, as long as it's milk from a non-kosher animal or meat from a non-kosher animal for that matter. So, okay. I think we'll discuss this more next week, but basically the prohibition of milk and meat was said by milk from a kosher animal and meat from a kosher animal.
Okay.
So, meat from a non-kosher animal, we're not allowed to eat for a different reason because it's not from a non-kosher animal. But the prohibition against milk and meat was not said there. So the prohibitions that are only relevant to milk and meat, like we said, like cooking it, we're not allowed to cook milk and meat together. Just the act of cooking is prohibited. So if, let's say, our non-Jewish friend comes in and asks you, can you please can you please just turn the fire on? I have this meat that I'm boiling in milk. Can you turn the fire on? We wouldn't be allowed to do that, halachically. But if it was pork, we would be allowed to. Because that's meat from a non-kosher animal, and the prohibition against milk and meat wasn't said that. You're right, but let's say usually we wouldn't, but let's say, like we said, it's a nanny, or let's say you're at work in the work kitchen. Okay, so these are very complicated laws. Once again, I'm not giving practical halacha. I'm just talking about some ramifications of this. Okay, but let's move on. Then it has the laws of the guilt offering in chapter 7, verse 1, and page 573. This is the teaching of the guilt offering. It is most holy. In the place where they shall slaughter the elevation offering, shall they slaughter the guilt offering. He shall throw its blood upon the altar all around. All of its fat he shall offer it, the tail of the fat that covers the innards, the tail and the fat that covers the innards, the two kidneys, the fat that covers them, which is on the flanks, he shall remove the diaphragm as well as the liver, as well as the kidneys. The Kohen shall cause him to go up and smoke on the altar, fire offering to Hashem. It is a guilt offering. This is the suet that we talked about last week. And we're going to talk more about it because every male among the Kohanim shall eat it, the rest of the offering. And let's see, the meal offering goes to the Kohanim. And in verse 7, it says, like the sin offering is a guilt offering, there's one law for them. It shall belong to the Kohen who performs its atonement offering. And that really means that all the Kohanim who were on duty that week, that they had a rotation of families of Kohanim who would do the service, and it was week by week. And they would work 2 weeks, each family of Kohanim would work 2 weeks a year. So the Kohanim that were on duty that week would eat that offering. Okay, and it continues. Where are we? And it continues, the height of the elevation offering that he offered shall belong to the Kohen, it shall be his. So this is true. Even the elevation offering that is completely burnt on the altar, the hide is not burnt on the altar, and it belongs to the Kohanim. And this is true about the sin offering, guilt offering as well. Okay. And in verse 16, now we're getting into what Shmuel was asking about the restrictions on when it has to be eaten. Actually, I'll back up a little bit. In verse 11, the Thanksgiving offering. This is the law of on page 575. This is the law of the feast peace offering that one will offer to Hashem if he shall offer it for Thanksgiving offering. This is a special offering that was brought in cases where a person was in dangerous situation and was saved by Hashem. For example, if he crossed the sea and came across safely, if he was very sick and he was healed, or if the person was in captivity, he was captured and was and got out safely, or if he crossed the desert safely. So in all these cases, he would bring a special offering called the Korban Todah, Thanksgiving offering. And nowadays, what we do with that's when someone goes up to the bima and they make a special Thanksgiving blessing. Like if someone was very sick and they got better, so they would make a special blessing by the bima. And in those cases, when we had the temple, when we had the tabernacle, they would bring this offering.
That'd be the same blessing that we have with plane travel.
Like overseas.
Yes.
I
just internet, but just not.
One sec.
But just from Savannah to Atlanta.
So usually we would make a blessing on the plane to, like for safe travel. But I'm talking about when you would go up to the bima and make a Thanksgiving blessing. Yes, Dr. Finn?
Yeah, we say bench goimel.
Yes, exactly. That's what we call it, bench goimel.
Okay.
Okay, so that's what we call it. Okay, so we would bench goimel So, and when we would bench goyimel here, they would bring an offering in the temple and in the tabernacle. And it says there that with loaves of leavened bread, he shall bring his offering. We said last week that usually when they were meal offerings, they were matzahs. In this case, they would bring chametz along with the offering. From it in verse 14, from it shall offer one from each as an offering. A portion to Hashem shall belong to the kohen who throws the blood of the peace offering. And the flesh of his feast Thanksgiving peace offering must be eaten on the day of its offering, and shall not leave any of it until morning. So there he has to eat it the same day and that night. It has to be eaten, and he can't leave any over. And if any is left over, it has to be burnt. And now in verse 16 on page 577, if his feast offering, this is a regular feast offering, for a vow or donation, it must be eaten on the day he offered his feast offering, and on the next day, what is left over may not be eaten. What is left over from the flesh of the feast offering shall be burned in the fire on the third day. So you could eat it the day that you brought it that night, the next day and that night, and the following day, it can't be eaten anymore. It has to be burned. And if some of the flesh of his feast Thanksgiving peace offering was intended to be eaten on the third day, it is not acceptable. And that is that if it was brought with intention to eat it later, so that invalidates the whole offering. Then there's a prohibition against eating any of the offerings when one is in a state of spiritual impurity. This is like ritual impurity.
So how do other coins know when they should and should not eat the thing? They look, okay, this is bought here, this is bought there.
No, it's just a matter of, they had to keep track of when the offering was brought, right?
They'd have to pass it on to the next person.
Yeah.
Wow.
So maybe like we do, like when we put things in the freezer, like my wife sometimes makes baby food. Like she'll she'll cook some, let's say, sweet potato. She'll what do you call it? She'll mash it, okay, and freeze it. Like she'll put it in ice cubes, like into portions, and freeze it. And she'll write on the bag when she did it. She'll just write on the bag the day that she put it in the freezer or the day that she made it. So she'll know that like after a certain amount of time, it's probably not good anymore. So I guess that's what the kohanim would have to do. They'd have to just like write on the whatever container they put this in that like eat it by this time. Okay, so now on page 579, the top, verse 22, Hashem spoke to Moshe saying, speak to the children of Israel, saying, any fat of oxen, sheep, or goats you shall not eat. And this is not referring to all the fat, even though we know now that it's not necessarily the best. Saturated fat isn't necessarily the best thing for us. This is referring to the suet, or suet. And that's the fats that mostly encase the organs.
That's right.
So it's the like the fat that encases the kidneys and the fat that encases the around the diaphragm, and fats of that nature, which in general are called, like we said, are called suet. But like fat and that you find in your meat, the marbling is perfectly fine.
So it was great to fry later on.
Yeah, that's what they say.
I remember doing it.
Okay.
By suet, brown suet, and render it.
I thought
Yeah, we are. He's saying not
This
as
is
not
going
kosher,
back
before kosher.
40.
Oh,
Yeah,
Well,
before his
from my
kosher. So
standpoint,
Dr. Finn says that he uses it as bird feed.
that's what.
Bird feed.
Okay.
That this is something that they sell as bird feed, and that's okay. It's only we're allowed to derive benefit from it when it's not allowed to eat it.
Right.
So any kosher meat you get, any meat that you buy with a certification doesn't have this, has it removed or doesn't have it in it. Okay. And in verse 26, you shall not consume any blood in any of your dwelling places, whether from fowl or from animals. Notice it says fowl and animals, what's left out is fish, and there is no prohibition against eating fish blood. But we cannot eat the blood of fowl and animals. And how do we avoid eating the blood? So there are two ways to do it. The usual way, if you're buying kosher meat from the store, any meat with kosher certification, it has had the blood removed already to halachic satisfaction. What we do to do it way back when, it used to be that people would bring their own animal to the sheichet, they would slaughter it. You'd have to do it on your own. So what would one have to do? We would soak it in water for half an hour. Then we would put salt on it, and we'd put it couldn't be like the regular salt, it would be kosher salt. That's why it's called kosher salt, is because it was used for koshering, for making the meat kosher, for removing the blood. Yes.
I saw a recipe for a stew.
Yeah.
Which calls for pork and
Kosher salt, right? Because a lot of cooks like it because of the texture of the salt. But it's called kosher salt because they would it's the kind of salt that was used for making meat kosher. It's coarser than regular salt. The problem with regular salt is that it's so fine that it would just get absorbed into the meat and wouldn't remove the blood.
Oh.
The kosher salt is more coarse, so it would stay on the surface of the meat and would pull all the blood out of the meat. So once again, you'd soak the meat for a half hour. I hope I have this right. You'd soak the meat for a half hour. Then you would cover the meat. You dry it, cover it with this kosher salt, and over like all the surfaces of the meat. Leave it that way for an hour, in a place where the meat would be able to drain, either on like a slanted surface or a surface that has holes at the bottom so the blood could drip out. Then you would rinse off the salt. You would rinse off all the salt and blood, and it's kosher. That meat is considered kosher. Yes.
It was more than an hour that they would leave it salted.
Halachically, that's what's required. That's what all I'm saying is that halachically, what's required is an hour. Technically, if one left it salted for 18 minutes, that would be enough. That the rabbi wouldn't say it's treif, but it's supposed to be an hour. Anything more than an hour is not required.
I thought it was more than an hour because I remember having to wash damn tractor trailer load of hanging beef.
Right.
It had been salted.
Right.
And it was been salted 3 or 4 days before. And it was hanging.
That's kind of iffy.
No, it was going from West Coast to
that's I think that's a different issue is that it should be soaked within 24 hours, within 3 days of when it was slaughtered. But and I actually read in Rabbi Emanuel Feldman's book. He wrote a book, Tales Out of Shul, that he writes a book about how he's had meat come in, and he would like go in with a fire hose and like hose down the meat.
I did it.
You did it with him, probably.
No, not with him.
Oh yeah.
Back in Miami.
Oh yeah.
I did it.
Yeah, and that's because if the blood was sitting on it for 3 days, so it might be assumed that it's not so easy to get out anymore. But like we said, so you would soak it for an hour. Soak it for half an hour. Put this kosher salt on, cover all the surfaces with kosher salt, leave that on for at least an hour, and then you'd rinse it off. That meat is kosher. Another way to make it kosher, and this is the faster way, like with beans, they have you soak it overnight or you do the quick soak. So there's the quick koshering for meat is you could just put a little bit of salt on. We rinse it off, put a little bit of salt on, put it on the grill. If you grill it, so then the heat of the fire draws the blood out, and and with the grill, usually you have like some space between what you put it on where the blood could drip, and that would also make it kosher. But like if you're cooking it, let's say in a cholent or in a stew where it's inside a pot, you couldn't do that because any blood that's coming out would remain in the pot, and that would be eating blood.
Be absorbed into the sauce and you never know what you're eating.
Exactly, right. So that would be a problem. But if you're grilling it, so any blood in there will drip out onto the coals or onto the propane, onto the flames, whatever it is, and that would be okay. Okay, so now what's that?
Before your time,
Yeah.
you would get rib steaks that were kosher steaks, but not yet salted, and they would always be grilled.
Yes, somebody's told me in the past in the class that they have like their mother's.
That's me.
That was you? I didn't remember who it was, but yeah. So you still have the salting board.
Well, I don't have the cover, but you would use like the cover of a bushel basket.
Yeah, and it would either have that's it. You'd either have to have, like I said, you'd either have to have something with holes like a mesh where the blood could drip down, or you'd have to have it would be on an angle so the blood would go down away from the meat.
It's called rail.
Yeah.
Got hooks. Take the side of the hook.
Right. So that's what they would do in an industrial situation. But someone who's doing it, but like Sid said, before they used to salt it at the butcher, you would go to the butcher, buy a piece of meat. So likely if you bought a chuck steak or a chuck roast, so you'd bring it home. So then you wouldn't necessarily have that hook. So every housewife would have a special like koshering board, which would be, like I said, would be either like, like where they say to salt eggplants. and you just salt it on like a grate, so the liquid would drip down, and that's what they do with meat as well. Okay, so now moving on. In chapter 8, it continues to the consecration of the Kohanim, and we had in Parshas Tzav, it gave the exact instructions and what they would do to consecrate the Kohanim, and here that was the mitzvah of how to do it. Here they actually did it. That it says Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying on page 581, chapter 8. Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, "Take Aaron and his sons with him, and the garments and the oil of anointment, the bull of the sin offering, the 2 rams, and the basket of matzahs." And he had them put the special clothing, the Kohen's vestments on them, and he brought the offerings that he was instructed, as we saw in Parshas Tzav, and that's really how the Parsha continues until the end of the Parsha on page 587. It continued in how exactly they would go about consecrating the Kohanim and inaugurating them as Kohanim. And in verse 36 on page 587, it concludes, Aaron and his sons carried out all the matters that Hashem commanded through Moshe. And now the Haftorah is I believe, the regular Haftorah for Parshas Tzav on page 1167. 1167 is the Haftorah for Tzav. And the same way that in this week's Parsha we have the instructions for more detailed instructions on how to bring the offerings. So we have a section from the prophet Yirmiyah, the prophet Jeremiah, about how we would have to bring offerings and the way the offerings should be brought. So it states, where am I? Yeah, so it states on page 1167, so said Hashem, Master of Legions, God of Israel, pile your Olah offerings upon your peace offerings and eat flesh, for I did not speak with your forefathers, nor did I command them on the day I took them out of the land of Egypt concerning Olah offerings and peace offerings. Rather, I commanded them regarding only this matter, saying, hear my voice, that I may be a God unto you, and you will be a people unto me, and you shall follow along the entire path which I command you, so that it will go well for you. But they did not hear, they did not incline their ear, they did follow their own counsel and their fancies of their evil heart, and they went backwards and not forwards. And the message of this Haftorah is that we have these mitzvahs of bringing offerings, and they're important, but it doesn't mean that we ignore the rest of the Torah, and it's okay as long as we bring offerings, everything's okay. It's the opposite, that offerings are only meaningful if we're bringing them sincerely, if we're bringing them as, with a full heart, as a way to connect with Hashem, become close with Hashem. But if we're not following the word of Hashem, we're ignoring the word of Hashem and trying to appease God by bringing offerings, so that's not what God asks of us. And we're saying those offerings are not meaningful. Okay.